Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world where fear is not an accident, not a side effect, but a carefully chosen tool. You find yourself standing on uneven medieval ground, the air cool, the streets narrow, and the rules simple in a way that feels almost dangerous. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings, not to mark time, but to announce that someone has crossed a line. You don't yet know what they did, and honestly, in this world, that almost doesn't matter. What matters is that something must be done, quickly, visibly, and painfully enough that you and everyone else won't even think about trying the same thing. You're probably already realizing this is not the kind of history you'd want to survive. And yes, you probably won't survive this, at least not comfortably. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what the local time is for you right now. Somewhere in the world it's very late, and that feels appropriate. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin to understand that medieval punishment was rarely designed as a long-term system. It was supposed to be a fix, a response, a blunt solution to a sharp problem. Crime happens, order breaks, fear spreads, so the authorities reach for the fastest tool they know: fear itself. In a time without modern policing, forensic science, or even consistent laws, punishment becomes a kind of emergency language, loud, visual, impossible to ignore. You begin to sense the shift happening almost invisibly. What starts as an emergency response becomes routine because routines feel stable. They feel controlled. Even violence, when repeated often enough, begins to feel normal, especially if it's framed as justice, especially if it's blessed by law, church, or crown. Religion plays its quiet role here, not always loudly, but persistently. Punishment is often described as correction, not cruelty. Pain is supposed to cleanse. Suffering is supposed to teach. You're told, explicitly or implicitly, that a little pain now saves the soul later. That idea makes it very easy to repeat punishment without questioning it too deeply. And you, standing in this imagined square, start to notice something unsettling. The crowd doesn't always look horrified. Sometimes they look bored. Sometimes entertained, sometimes annoyed at the delay. The fear that was meant to stop crime once is already dulling, already needing to be refreshed with something harsher, louder, more permanent. So authorities escalate, not because they plan to, but because the system nudges them there. Fear, like any tool, loses its edge with use, and instead of putting it away, they sharpen it again and again, until it becomes part of everyday governance. You can almost feel the system locking into place. Punishment is no longer a response. It's a habit, a reflex, a tradition in the making. And traditions, as you know, are very hard to kill. As the night deepens, you carry this understanding forward. Medieval punishment wasn't born from endless cruelty. It was born from urgency, from limited options, from a belief that one strong action could solve a complex human problem. But once fear proved useful, no one seemed eager to let it go. And that's where the real story begins, because everything that follows grows out of this single choice: to turn punishment into a public shortcut, and then forget it was ever meant to be temporary. You remain in the square a little longer, long enough to notice how carefully everything is arranged. Nothing here feels accidental. The post stands where it always stands. The wood is worn smooth, not from age alone, but from repetition. Hands have touched it before. Bodies have leaned against it before. And tomorrow someone else will stand there again. This isn't chaos. It's choreography. You start to realize that medieval punishment wasn't just about the person being punished. It was about everyone else. The crowd is not a side effect. It's the point. Every pair of eyes, every held breath, every nervous shuffle of feet is part of the mechanism. Fear works better when it's shared, when it becomes a collective memory instead of a private wound. The people around you aren't all the same. Some look anxious, their faces tight, as if imagining themselves in the same position. Others look almost detached, scanning the scene the way you might scan a notice board. A few seem irritated, glancing toward the market stalls as if this is an inconvenience delaying their day. That contrast is important. It tells you something uncomfortable. Fear doesn't stay sharp forever. A mainstream historical fact quietly anchors itself here. Many medieval towns had fixed punishment, sites that rarely moved for centuries. The stocks, the pillory, the whipping post weren't temporary installations. They were permanent features of urban life, like wells or churches. Children grew up knowing exactly where punishment happened. The way you know where traffic lights are supposed to be. And children are watching now. You notice them near the edges of the crowd, half hidden behind adults, eyes wide but curious. No one shields them for long. There's no sense that this is inappropriate viewing. In fact, it's often seen as educational. Learn early, learn clearly, learn where the line is and what happens when you cross it. Here's an odd detail that still unsettles historians. Some medieval towns adjusted punishment severity based on crowd size. If attendance was low, the punishment might be postponed. Not canceled, just rescheduled. Justice apparently was more effective with an audience. Fear needed witnesses to fully function. Scholars still argue whether this public exposure genuinely reduced crime or merely changed how crimes were committed. Pickpocketing didn't vanish. It became subtler. Theft didn't disappear. It moved to quieter places. What punishment often produced wasn't obedience but adaptation. You feel that adaptation in the air. People aren't shocked anymore. They've learned how to watch without reacting, how to stand close without feeling involved. Fear becomes background noise, like the murmur of the crowd itself. And when fear becomes familiar, authorities face a problem they didn't anticipate. They need to refresh it. That's when punishment starts to escalate. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but incrementally. A little longer in the stocks, a little more force, a little more humiliation. Each change justified as necessary. Each one framed as a response to crime getting worse. Even when records suggest crime levels often stayed the same. Religion continues to smooth the edges. Pain is explained as moral correction. Public shame becomes public cleansing. You hear phrases repeated often enough that they stop sounding cruel. For the good of the soul. For the health of the town. Language, like fear, becomes a tool. You stand there long enough to feel the boredom creep in yourself. Not because you approve of what's happening, but because repetition dulls emotion. That realization lands quietly and heavily. If even you can feel it, imagine what years of this does to a community. Punishment becomes routine because routine feels safe, predictable, ordered. In a world full of disease, famine, and sudden death, at least this part of life feels controlled. Someone breaks a rule. Something happens. The pattern repeats. There's comfort in that, even when it's brutal. As the crowd begins to thin, you notice how quickly people return to their lives. Conversations resume. Baskets are lifted. Deals continue. The square resets itself with disturbing efficiency. The post remains. The memory lingers, but only faintly. Tomorrow will look very much like today. You take one last look before moving on. Aware now that this wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was a system, learning how to sustain itself. And systems once settled rarely ask whether they still make sense. You walk away carrying that thought with you, knowing the next thing you'll notice is how humiliation, not just pain, becomes one of the most powerful weapons of all. You don't get very far from the square before you realize that pain was never the only currency being traded there. In many cases, it wasn't even the most important one. What truly lingered, long after the crowd dispersed and the wood cooled under the open sky, was shame. Pain fades, bruises heal, but shame has a way of following you home, sitting quietly beside you, and waking up with you the next morning. You begin to understand that medieval authorities learned this lesson quickly. If fear was the spark, shame was the slow burn. And unlike physical punishment, shame was cheap. No tools to maintain, no guards to pay, no schedules to manage. Once applied, it worked on its own. You picture the stocks again, not as instruments of pain, but as instruments of exposure. Locked in place, unable to turn away, unable to hide your face. Every passerby gets a clear look. Some stare, some laugh, some pretend not to see, which somehow feels worse. The goal isn't injury. The goal is memory, yours and everyone else's. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. Public shaming punishments like stocks and pillories were among the most common medieval penalties, precisely because they were non-lethal and reusable. Towns could punish dozens of people a week without killing or permanently disabling them. In theory, this was merciful. In practice, it was relentless. You start to notice how deeply social medieval life was. Privacy barely existed. Communities were tight, overlapping, inescapable. Everyone knew where you lived, who your family was, what you did for work. Being shamed publicly didn't just affect you for an afternoon. It redefined how people treated you afterward. The butcher might serve you last. The innkeeper might watch you more closely. Neighbors might lower their voices when you walk past. Here's an odd detail that feels almost cruel in its subtlety. Some towns allowed the public to throw soft objects, rotten vegetables, mud, offal, during shaming punishments, but only at designated times. Too much enthusiasm was discouraged. Order mattered, even in humiliation. Chaos wasn't the goal. Controlled degradation was. Scholars still argue whether public shaming worked because it deterred crime or because it reinforced conformity. The system didn't just punish illegal behavior, it punished social deviation. Being poor, being loud, being foreign, being inconvenient. The line between criminal and undesirable was thin, and shame erased it entirely. You imagine standing there, not hurt, not bleeding, but fully visible. Your body becomes a message board. Your presence becomes a warning. And the worst part is that once released, you don't leave the punishment behind. You carry it into every interaction that follows. That's how something meant to correct behavior once becomes a long-term sentence. Not written into law, but enforced socially. The authorities don't need to intervene again. The community does the rest. Religion once again smooths the edges. Humility is praised. Public correction is framed as moral guidance. You're told that enduring shame patiently is virtuous, that accepting your place restores harmony. Resistance only deepens suspicion, and you begin to see the long-term effect. When shame becomes routine, people internalize it. They police themselves. They avoid attention. They learn to stay small. Crime doesn't vanish, but risk-taking does. Innovation does. Dissent does. You notice something else, something quieter. The crowd reacts differently to repeat offenders. The first time, there's curiosity. The second time, recognition. By the third, indifference. Shame loses its edge too. And when that happens, the system faces the same problem it faced with fear. It has to go further. Longer hours in public view. More elaborate displays. Signs hung around necks describing crimes in blunt terms. The message must be clearer, louder, impossible to misunderstand. You feel the weight of it settling into place. Punishment is no longer about stopping a single act. It's about shaping behavior across an entire population. About teaching people not just what not to do, but who not to be. As you move through the streets, you notice how people avert their eyes from the punishment site even after it's empty. The space itself has absorbed meaning. The post doesn't need a body to function anymore. Its presence alone is enough. And that's when you realize something unsettling. The system has succeeded too well. Fear and shame are no longer temporary tools. They're embedded into daily life, into architecture, into memory, into habit. You walk on, knowing the next thing you'll encounter isn't humiliation, but escalation, because when shame stops working, pain returns sharper than before, and aimed at the body in ways that can't be easily undone. You begin to notice that when shame alone no longer satisfies the system, the body itself becomes the record. Words can be ignored. Memories can fade. But marks, those are harder to escape. Medieval punishment slowly shifts its focus from temporary suffering to permanent visibility. The goal changes quietly. Don't just scare people away from crime. Make sure they carry proof of disobedience with them forever. Branding, for example, starts as a practical solution. Authorities need a way to identify repeat offenders quickly. A mark on the skin seems efficient, simple, no paperwork required. A letter burned into flesh announces history at a glance. Thief, liar, outcast, the body becomes a document that never needs translation. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. Branding and physical marking were legally sanctioned punishments. Across much of medieval Europe, especially for crimes like theft, vagrancy, and fraud, these marks weren't hidden. They were placed where everyone could see: hands, cheeks, foreheads. Visibility was the point. Here's an odd detail that still startles modern readers. In some regions, the exact location of a brand mattered more than the size. A mark on the face carried far more social weight than one on the arm. The punishment wasn't just pain, it was social erasure. You couldn't blend back in. You couldn't start over. Scholars still argue whether such punishments reduced repeat offenses or simply made survival harder for those already punished. Once marked, legitimate work becomes scarce. Suspicion follows you everywhere, and when survival itself becomes difficult, crime often becomes the only remaining option. You realize the cruelty isn't always loud. It's administrative, logical, cold, marking. Someone once feels cheaper than dealing with them again. The system convinces itself it's being efficient, not brutal. Religion again provides language that softens the reality. The mark is framed as a warning, not a sentence. A reminder of sin. A chance for repentance. But repentance doesn't erase the mark, and neither does forgiveness. As you walk through the town, you imagine recognizing these signs on people you pass. A hand kept hidden in a sleeve. A face turned slightly away. These small gestures speak volumes. Punishment has extended beyond the square. It now lives in posture, in movement, in silence. And once bodies are marked, the line between justice and exclusion blurs completely. The system no longer just punishes behavior. It categorizes people. You move on, aware that when marking isn't enough, when even permanent reminders fail, the system reaches for something more drastic, something that removes ability itself.